The second chapter is a pretty easy read. He mentions in here theories of language acquisition, and it has a couple of individuals, Stephen Krashen and a man by the name of Jim Cummins. Cummins has a quote on page 33. Language and content will be acquired most successfully when the students are challenged cognitively, but provided with contextual linguistic supports or scaffolds for successful task completion. If you remember your educational theory, Vygotsky, the Russian, kind of rescued from obscurity. I think they found his papers long after he was shot by Stalin. He argued that we learn best those things that are just out of reach, okay? An example would be if you were studying math and you were trying to understand an algebraic problem or quadratic equations where you have two parentheses and you have like 2x plus 3 times 5x minus 1. And you had to work those out. And sometimes what you do is you break it down to something just a little simpler, and then people are able to handle both sides of the equation and understand what they're looking at. And then you show them how to multiply those two items in parentheses, because maybe that confuses them having, how do you handle that? It's all in parentheses. Well, another example would be, if I were teaching you how to say a word in Spanish and you didn't quite get it, and it was the word like señora or Antonio, autumn, and you kept saying, what is that weird little sound there? And I said, well, it's the tilde over the N. And you might say, well, it's not on every N. I said, that's right, only on certain ones. So how do you say the tilde over there? And I said, well, it's the N in onion. It's a little different. You could even, if you're a speech person, you could describe where your tongue is and how your mouth is held. And that would be another way to do it. So I like in ESL that you know something about pronunciation in English, where you put your tongue for certain sounds, the difference between a B and a V. Okay, and that's very subtle. People get confused when they try to go from English to Korean or back, and the L and the R get confused. And you say, why is that? And you have to explain it. It's because the L and the R are one sound in Korean, but in English, we separate them. There's an L and there's an R, okay? So that's an example of cognitively making sure you don't make people jump too far ahead. I always found that true in science. So if you show me how to do a chemical formula, don't blow through the whole thing and say, there it is. I said, but how'd you get from this step to the next step to the next step? I want to see you moving that form over there. And so that's one thing that you have to be aware cognitively. Now, in terms of an ESL person, you've got the double whammy of you need a context. And they need to have a scaffolding or a context where you show how you move from that. I'm going to look for a tape. It's actually from Stephen Krashen. It has him teaching German by drawing a picture, And so he draws the face. In Spanish, it'd be la cara, okay, the face. But in German, he has another one, and he points to it and says it, and then everybody, oh, well, that's what that is. See, he's literally pointing to something he's drawn, and you know what it is in English by visually the context. That's why I love visual clues, because people can figure out what they are, and it's kind of fun. And that's the other part of this, is that while you're giving them clues, you're not teaching them something in a way that's boring and depressing. You don't have some monotone voice, and you don't just read from a lecture. I know you're excited when you see me and you're on screen. Say, Dr. Tracy's going to explain that chapter. Okay. And then you get bored after about 1 or 2 times watching videos. And I have to think of something else. If I stood on my head and did this, you'd think it's interesting for a little while, but it wouldn't be pretty. But the idea is that context is very important. So Krashen, in his example, draws the face and the beard and the mouth and the teeth and the ears, and he talks about them. And he's using German. He's speaking German, but you know what he's saying because you got a context. That's why you have to think about ESL. If you're going to teach about American history and you start out saying, we're going to talk about the Oregon Trail, and you don't really, and if a person looks up the word Oregon and you look up the word trail, they might get an idea of what that is. But the whole idea of the Oregon Trail is more than just a route from Kansas City or St. Louis to Oregon, or the Santa Fe Trail. It has a context within it. It's got a historical context. The Native Americans, the wagon trains, the Donner Party. If you miss that one, you're lucky. You want to miss that party. That's one place you don't want to go for a barbecue. And if you don't know the context, I'm going to make you look it up. DONNER. So it's got so much rich cultural aspects to it that you as a teacher have to provide visuals, maybe a movie. And you have to help them understand, because if you have an ESL student who knows about hunting trails or knows about roads and things like that, the Oregon Trail wasn't a road. They just made a road. They just took off and tried to make their way to the west. So it's very important that you have a context, and that's really what Krashen's talking about. And his notion is that, I don't know if we have a quote in here. I got the one from Cummins. Oh, yeah, a couple of other concepts. When I talked about making it interesting, I'm also talking about making it accessible and pleasant, because the person's natural inclination in learning language is to keep their mouth shut and observe. If you can make them more comfortable and you can give them a room where they're free to take a chance and open their mouth and not be laughed at, that's called the affective filter. And I'll explain. Affective means emotional, and filter means we tend to block things when we're emotionally upset or nervous. If you ever had a situation where you were very stressed out and you're taking a test and suddenly you can't remember things because your stress is so great that your natural ability to remember is stressed out. Or if you're listening to someone and they're explaining something to you and you know it's math and it's really hard and you're stressed out while they're talking, you won't understand it, okay? And you won't be able to repeat it back or explain what they mean, because maybe the professor is intimidating, or maybe you're afraid you're going to make a mistake and you're going to look bad. So you're just nervous and you just keep it inside you. That's called the affective filter. And when the affective filter, AFFECTIVE, when the affective filter is up, when it's raised up, it's like a shield. It's really not a filter. It blocks. It should be the affective block. Instead of filtering, there is no filtering. It blocks everything. Math. A lot of people are very upset and nervous about math. When they get instruction in math, they just shut down. They don't really understand it, and they start out saying, I don't understand math. I was that way about music. I couldn't figure out music at all. You know, I didn't realize how you're supposed to listen to music, and I couldn't understand notes or tone or any of that. It was all just the biggest mystery to me you can imagine. And so I had an affective filter blocked. I like words and reading, but I didn't like music, and I didn't understand art. And things like that were just mysterious to me. I just thought they were odd. So that's some basic things from Krashen. I'm going to try to get his video just because I like it. He makes a great case for, sorry, that's my other Well, we've now gone to 7 o'clock. I've talked too long. I'm going to try to make this a little shorter. The factors that affect second language acquisition. A big one is motivation. If you go to your high school Spanish class, or if you're a member of that, or a French class, and you didn't enjoy it, then one could assume that you were not very motivated, or maybe it was an unpleasant, the way it was taught, it wasn't interesting, it was a lot of exams, or maybe the teacher did the same thing day after day, and you just saw it as kind of weird. And so it was kind of your class to goof off, and you'd memorize just enough to get by on the quizzes. But you didn't really learn the language, and maybe they didn't teach it very well. Another one factor is age, although I don't buy into that, because the idea that older you get, you're less able to learn a language because of something changes in the brain. Your brain is just as fresh as you want to make your brain. Brain, unless there's some disease process, an older brain is still a very good brain. I like to think mine is. You know, when I turned 49 last year, okay. But the idea is that age is more of a mindset than it is a physical, biological truth. I've seen I was in a class once where a high school assistant principal was trying to be taught Spanish for an exercise. This was 20 years ago. And every time he was supposed to produce a word in Spanish, he would go, And I told him, I said, and he was so bad, he just said, I can't do it. I can't say a word in Spanish. That's because he wouldn't do it. It wasn't because he didn't hear the word or he couldn't say the word. It's because he was so mentally opposed to learning Spanish and didn't like the whole process that he didn't even have fun with it. It's almost like he was gagging to get the word out. He couldn't say tortilla or anything. And it was kind of funny to watch, and I was wondering, why is he so resistant? And I think the real problem was that I told somebody at the time, it's like trying to teach a minister to cuss. This man's just not going to produce the words. No way. He's not going to produce the words. So that's a joke. So the motivation is very low. Family can have a lot to do with it. A family that embraces language and reading at home, you know, that's a huge benefit for children. I'm a great believer in native speakers having books in their native language and being very free about teaching reading in their native language to children. The process of learning reading, I'm not an expert. I won't say it's the same, but the process and the adventure of learning to read is the same, I would say. I've actually seen cases where parents would want their kid to learn English. It would literally throw out anything in their own language, or they didn't have books in Spanish or anything. No, you must learn English. So the child didn't experience learning fairy tales or little stories or anything. And some of those are the same story taught in a different language. And that exercise of learning the stories and constructing sequence in the brain and being able to tell a story, which is the most natural part of a human academic or cognitive ability, is to be able to tell a story and sequence it. Having access to language, having the books, and the personality. I think personality makes a big difference. Although some students, I would say in learning to speak and listen, you have to be an extrovert. It helps. Or you have to be in a situation that you feel safe if you're an introvert, so you can produce language. We had a very good high school Spanish experience. We had to speak all the time. We had to speak in Spanish right from the beginning. And I thought that was fun. But, sometimes people get very resistant. They say, why are we using Spanish? I want you to explain the grammar in English. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. So it gives some examples in there about teaching and the quality of instruction and routine. you want people to have a routine so they're very comfortable in the classroom, not just little kids, but I mean, you want your Spanish class, you want to have breaks, you don't want to have three minutes. I mean, you want to have 30 minutes of somebody explaining grammar points to you. You want to be able to read. I remember in my Spanish class, we had to read little short stories that were funny. I remember one, and after all these years, I still remember it. It was almost 10 years ago. A man was stuck in a house, and the guy had told him that he had the windows blacked out. And he told him that he was in bed, and he kept telling him, no, you need to go back to sleep. I told you the nights here are really long. So he kept him in the bed for three days and kept insisting that, no, it's only 2:00 in the morning. He'd mess with the clocks. And so the little joke was the nights are really long. And so he had spent like 2 days in bed and just couldn't understand it. And he said, wow, I'm not tired anymore. And he said, no, you'll be tired. It's a long night. But silly little stories like that. There was one, the man with 3 hats, or 3-cornered hat. And they're little stories, but I still remember them because they were just, they weren't too long. They were easy to grasp. And there was a little context to them, and then we discussed about them. And so that's really important, I think. Now, I'm not going to, where it talks about interactionist behavior learning, cognitive theories. You can read that. I'm not particularly interested in that. I just want to say to you that the old 18th century adage about Samuel Johnson, a great English writer and critic, said, literature must be instructive and it must be entertaining. So I want to read a book. I want to enjoy reading it. And then I also want to learn things from reading it. So it has to be both of those qualities. Whatever you do in school, especially with English second language, if it's a grind, I mean, if you're literally teaching them grammar and grammar rules day after day, you are on the wrong track. And if sadly your school insists on some method of instruction that leaves the kids bored and not being engaged, then that's a failure. You can't teach using just one approach. You have to have interaction. Students have to produce something, and they have to get that validated. And give you an example. I had a teacher one time. I had to observe her student teaching many years ago, French teacher. And in her second semester or second year at French, I think she taught her 3 years, she actually had students writing about their personal lives, about their thoughts and things. They were writing journals in French in their second year. Now, writing like a diary or a journal about yourself and writing it in French to explain things to the teacher, that's an incredible achievement. Never thought of that in a class. But the student would write about what's going on. Imagine if you're in ESL and you have students write about, some issues. I mean, you obviously have to use some discretion there. But imagine if you wrote about different issues in the kid's life, and they had to write in English and explain it. So they really were working to come up with the right words, both from spoken English and looking up words and explaining. And then they interacted in that French class just like that. And I remember she also brought up a bunch of refrigerator boxes, and they cut out, moved the desks out of the room somewhere, and they built it so it looked like a French village, and they had to have things to sell, and they had to do all the transactions in French. And she even had francs. She even had some French money or something plastic or whatever. And so these kids were doing business like in a village, and they were eating French food, and they were writing journals in French. That class is exactly what you would want for ESL. Language teaching is highly interactive, and it's got to be exciting. It's got to be challenging, and it's got to be kind of some magnetism to it. So that's what I take from this chapter. And so if you come out and say, well, we're going to go over sentences again. We're going to grind these out. You're not putting anything in their heads. You're not challenging them. I'm going to try to find that video of Krashen, and I got another little video called Mrs. Amin Teaches a Language Lesson. And I think some of you have seen it, but I'm going to put that on just because it'll be good. And so as I go during the week, I sometimes run across stuff or think of more stuff. So I'm going to try to put it down there, or I may email to you on the announcement, but I want you to look at it because it's good stuff, okay? All right, so you only have the discussion and that map for the weekend. So other than just listening to me and a couple other, and that one tape about another aspect of ESL. I'm trying to give you a lot of things. I'm not going to sit here and test you about them. I want you to get exposed to them. I want you to write down notes. And I want you to, you know, to have knowledge and keep track of things so that you can go back and find stuff. And keep a little list of web sources, okay? Well, that's all for right now.